Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And Justin, today we're going to talk about mineral rights and energy news for December of 2023. And, this one, to be honest, was a little bit of a struggle getting the articles put together, but I think we do have a really solid set of articles to cover today and kind of cover the gamut of energy and minerals related lawsuits and things like that here in the United States, as well as a lot of global turmoil as it relates to energy, which we've seen in the last couple of weeks. So we'll talk a lot about that, and some of which is still going on right now. And we'll dive into that here in a minute.
Absolutely, Matt. And to start it off here, I'm sure many mineral owners have noticed the low price of oil, and OPEC just announced that they're planning to do production cuts, though it's leaving the oil market skeptical. The article goes on to say here that OPEC Plus members have agreed to make voluntary cuts to oil production in 2024 in an increasingly fraught attempt to bolster the market, but crude prices fell due to signs of ongoing strains in the group. Saudi Arabia pledged to extend an existing voluntary cut of 1 million barrels a day until the end of the first quarter, while Russia said it would be deepening its existing voluntary export reduction. So Saudi Arabia needs a price closer to $100 a barrel to fund their ambitious economic reform program. But as times has faced pushback from the White House because of the worry for inflation if the price of oil increases. And so, Matt, very interesting that OPEC is saying voluntary cuts here. It kind of sets the stage for really what their intent is and kind of the turmoil that's going on in the oil and gas world internationally.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there, because this meeting itself was actually delayed by 4 days, I believe. And it was originally going to be an in-person meeting in Vienna, and they ended up doing it virtually. And I think there is a lot to read into the messaging that they released. And to your point, Justin, them saying it's a voluntary cut, and really interesting. And the first time ever that something like this has happened, where they said additional cuts might be forthcoming, but you'll hear from that directly from the member nations and not from the OPEC itself. And so they made some pledges, like you mentioned, Saudi and Russia being the largest, as a few other countries have some smaller reductions. All of that totals 2.2 million barrels per day in terms of the cuts, but there might be more coming, is what they said. And for the first time that I've ever heard it, and I believe I read this as well, that it was really unprecedented sort of language that they've used in saying that other countries may decide to either increase their voluntary cuts or to introduce a cut where they haven't had one before. And usually you always hear about it from OPEC, as a group, and through OPEC itself as an organization. In this case, they said, no, you're going to hear about that directly from those countries. So I think there's a lot to be read into that there is a lot of disagreement within OPEC right now around the direction that they should be going, how much to cut, how much to not cut. And I think a lot of it is really driven by, like you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, where they need prices to be high in order to fund their economic reforms and the investments that they want to make to reduce their dependence on oil prices. But ultimately, I think they need prices close to $80 a barrel in order to even break even, and at least $100 a barrel to provide the funding, like you said, to where Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman can invest in those economic reforms that he's been planning. And so I think from a U.S. perspective, we're spoiling the party a little bit from OPEC again this time around, because we're back to reaching peak production here in the U.S. in terms of oil production records that we're setting. We're producing more oil now than we were prior to the pandemic. And in the past, OPEC was driving the bus in terms of oil prices. And now what we're seeing is other countries besides just OPEC also have a big influence on oil prices, to where that stabilized in kind of steady production from the U.S. and, a downward trend in terms of the global economic situation is putting some downward pressure on prices. And I think also what we're seeing is that analysts are skeptical about OPEC, and the fact that we saw the price of oil fall sort of in the hours after this announcement just shows that they're not believing that they're going to be doing what they say they're going to do, and or that there'll be additional cuts, I think is what to read into that.
Yep, absolutely, man. And I think this kind of goes to some of the stories that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, where there's just uncertainty on the place that we're at with the green transition and how quickly we put our foot down on the accelerator on making that happen. And Matt, our next story here is something we talked about several months ago now, but this was a lawsuit that was happening in Boulder County where the operator, it was a question of whether they were going to enforce the lease. And long story short, they ended up siding with the operator. But Matt, it's really interesting how this ended up playing out. Basically, to set the stage, it was about the oil and gas company shutting in these wells due to certain circumstances. And then Boulder County wanted to terminate this lease and use it as a way to remove the ability for the oil and gas production in that area in the future. And then the court decided that the operator's lease was enforceable and that even though they had shut in those wells, they were still working those wells and that those leases were sound. And it sets some precedent, Matt, in Colorado for future cases and how those will be handled and how those will be looked at.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They actually said that in this particular case, the question about the cessation of production and whether that would have triggered termination of those leases, they say that in this particular case, those leases made it clear that only that cessation of production would be permanent without reworking or drilling occurring. And, they were doing work and maintenance operations, and they had to do it because it was a third-party pipeline that was shut in, and this was in 2014. And those maintenance operations from that pipeline company caused the operator in this case to shut in production for like 122 days or something like that. And that particular event, because of the way it happened and what happened, did not trigger the termination of the lease. And so I think that was an important precedent that sets the validity of these contracts. So if you have an oil and gas lease, if an operator shuts in production, but they're still within the terms of the lease to where it's still valid, at least in Colorado, it shows that you don't have a case to go and like try to terminate the lease, whether it's to try to negotiate more favorable terms and you're in favor of oil and gas development, or in this case, Boulder County, which is not in my backyard county in the Front Range in Colorado, very, I would say, left-leaning county, very anti-fossil fuel development, and they were wanting to basically use this as a way to terminate the lease so that those wells would have to be plugged and abandoned. There'd be no production within the county, very much wanting to stop that and doing their part, within their control within the county. And this was the Board of County Commissioners that was one of the parties to the lawsuit. And then, of course, the Crestone Peak, which now is Civitas, was the defendant. And the other thing that they mentioned, which I think was very interesting, is that they didn't want to set the precedents. And I'll just read from the actual ruling here. And they say, in Colorado, we interpret each oil and gas lease on its own terms. So that was kind of what they said, so rather than setting precedents and saying whether or not adopting the rule of commercial discovery to define production, and then, that sort of a thing, which I guess had been done by the Oil and Gas Commission or maybe by the previous courts. And they kind of affirmed the judgment of the Court of Appeals, but with a different reasoning and saying we declined to adopt any universal definition for production in oil and gas leases in Colorado, but rather determine the party's meaning within the context of the lease. So it really kind of falls back to the lease each time as to what should be done in the language of that lease. And so I thought that was interesting that they were sort of avoiding setting a precedent from that standpoint. But then important thing here is that they upheld the validity of a contract like an oil and gas lease and saying, no, if it was in writing and the terms were being met by the operator, you can't just arbitrarily get out of the lease for a related reason, saying, well, no, we're going to claim that it was because of the maintenance situation and the timing and all of that. So important decision here from a mineral owner perspective. Again, it just shows that when you sign an oil and gas lease, it just becomes really important to make sure you negotiate terms that you can live with for the duration of that lease. So should the lease get extended into the secondary term, if the operator drills a well that's successful and they produce oil and gas, that lease is going to be in effect, as long as production continues. And from like we've seen, there's cases where you have leases that were signed in the 60s or whatever that are still in effect today because there's still been continuous production the whole time. And so if you just sign a lease without negotiating it, you could be setting yourself up and your heirs really to deal with unfavorable terms or to not have the rights you could have had otherwise if you'd negotiated for better terms and or higher royalty rates and things like that. So you need to think about bigger picture, think about what are the actual terms of the lease, and sometimes that can actually have a bigger impact on the value of your property than the initial lease bonus that you receive. So that's always important to think about.
You said it, Matt. And, I think had this gone a different way and they decided to let this be a reason for the lease to be terminated, it would change the game for the operators. I mean, the operator would then be terrified to shut in whales, and that might have an effect on either safely producing those minerals or taking the proper steps to keep from having some issues. Important on the operator side too, and what a game changer it would have been had it gone differently.
That's a great point. If they had real differently, it would have thrown the oil and gas industry into chaos, I think, in Colorado, because you would have the ability for lessors to sort of willy-nilly decide that, no, we're going to get out of this lease. And so there would be, I think, a big negative impact on future development if that had been the case. So I think that was good to see that they upheld that portion of kind of the contract law side of things. And, I guess it kind of boils down to, each lease, you got to take it on a case-by-case basis, and they weren't going to draw a line on the sand necessarily, which doesn't really change anything in that case. So
you nailed it. All right, up next, Matt. It's interesting what's becoming the public narrative and there's two sides of this table. And there's a letter from OPEC that came out November 27th, and it was in response to the International Energy Agency's report on the oil and gas industry and net zero transitions. And it's not terribly surprising, Matt, that OPEC takes this stance that would kind of be expected, but they're really bringing up some valid points. And I'm going to go through and just kind of highlight some of these areas. So OPEC Secretary General said that it's ironic that the IEA, an agency that has repeatedly shifted its narratives and focus on a regular basis in recent years, now addresses the oil and gas industry and says that this is a moment of truth. The manner in which the IEA has unfortunately used its social media platforms in recent days to criticize and instruct the oil and gas industry is undiplomatic, to say the least. OPEC itself is not an organization that would prescribe to others what they should do, which is a bit of a funny statement from OPEC, Matt. Regrettably, the IEA report now also calls technologies such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage an illusion, even though Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment reports endorse such technologies as part of the solution to tackle climate change. The truth that needs to be spoken is simple and clear to those who wish to see it. It is that the energy challenges before us are enormous and complex and cannot be limited to one binary question. And so, Matt, it's a great point that he's bringing up, and something we've talked about for a while, in that this is a long transition that needs to take place, and it would be unwise and could cause a lot of problems to be short-sighted on that and say, okay, fossil fuels and other what we call dirty energy needs to go away overnight.
yeah, exactly. I think that they are really advocating for an orderly transition, which I think is really what is needed to minimize human suffering. I think that the concept that they mention is that they want to make sure that people have access to the energy that they need to live a comfortable and long life. And I think it's really interesting. We were talking before we hit record how there's sort of two moral views that are at odds here. You have on the IEA side, who's fully, I think, adopted the UN and sort of the anti-fossil fuel rhetoric and, the electrification of everything as the holy grail. And the timing of this was not coincidental. It really was directly related to the COP28 conference, which is going on right now. It's the UN Climate Change Conference, which happens to be going on in the United Arab Emirates, which has been much to the chagrin of the environmental movement, because the UAE is such a large oil and gas producer. And even the president of COP28, who's within the UAE, said phase out of coal, oil, and gas would take world back into caves. And so they fully see that there's really And they're challenging, they said there's no science indicating that the phase out of fossil fuels is needed to restrict global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so then basically, if you were just to phase it out, it's not going to allow for development unless you want to take the world back into caves. And so they're saying, well, you have to have a plan to get from here to there. They're realists. They also benefit from oil and gas production, so they want to see that continue and see that transition be orderly. But then I think from a moral standpoint, you have these two opposing viewpoints. And when we interviewed Alex Epstein on the show in his book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, there's sort of these two viewpoints. And the first being that this anti-fossil fuel movement often has the viewpoint that the earth is this nurturing environment that we're damaging and that humans are bad and they need to be stopped, so that we don't damage the earth. And then the other side of that is that the earth is actually a very hostile environment, and without technology and without energy, we would all be suffering and or be dying in a lot higher rates, due to cold or to heat and things like that, which we can control by harnessing energy to heat our homes, to cool our homes in the summertime. And then, just in terms of refrigeration and keeping food and medicine and having those things that extend our life expectancies. So there's these sort of two moral viewpoints out there, I think, that are, at odds. And we're seeing that play out with this tweet that the IEA released the week, I think it was November 27th. And then that directly triggered OPEC to issue this letter, which basically said that we need to be doing both things. We need to have affordable, reliable energy, and we need to be reducing the impact in terms of emissions. And that can be done by using things like carbon capture and storage, different technological solutions to tackle climate change, and not having this knee-jerk reaction to just shut everything off tomorrow. And then, all of a sudden, we'll be fine, which is a lie, I think. And so it's really interesting to see this play publicly on X and, other social media platforms where they're fighting this verbal war on pro-fossil fuel side of things and pro-energy, and then the anti-fossil fuels and sort of anti-human movement. So really kind of interesting.
You said it, Matt. And, I think the oil and gas industry is getting an unfair shake at methane emissions because it's not the only source of methane emissions. And I think if you asked the average person, we don't see the amount of coverage on other sources of methane emissions. And it's very easy to start thinking that, oh, okay, this is all oil and gas. That's just certainly not the case.
Yeah. And I mean, certainly there is a fair amount within oil and gas, and there should be work to mitigate that and to stop it from happening. And so that, obviously from a capitalist standpoint, from a mineral owner point of view, any emission that gets emitted into the atmosphere is are molecules that we didn't receive royalties on because they weren't sold in the pipeline. So from that standpoint, and then also just from the environmental standpoint and the safety standpoint, we want to minimize those releases of methane. And so the work that is being done, and I think states like Colorado obviously are leading the regulation to minimize and to monitor methane, and companies have the technology now to improve that and to take things out of the system. Now they have air operated valves and things like that are less of a chance that you're going to have an emission source. It's like every fitting you have on the wellhead or every fitting you have on a valve is a potential emission source. And so they're looking at, okay, how do we leverage engineering and different technologies for the next well pads? And then that becomes a way that over time you can eliminate those sources of emission. And then they have technology like these infrared cameras. They can monitor in real time and see where there are sources and go and target it. And certain states are doing things to put those regular monitoring requirements and regular audits in place so that operators can stay on top of it. And that's a responsible thing to do, and I think it should be done for sure. And so I think the more of that we see across the industry is good for the industry and for the people that live near these well sites as well. And so obviously one of the things you want to see if you had a well, in your backyard or in your field, if you're ranching or farming nearby, you want that to be contained within the pipe. And, certainly that's what the operators want as well. So yeah, lots to come from this is not over. Obviously the COP28 summit or thing is just a political event. These people, thousands of people coming from all across the globe. Obviously, they're flying in planes to go there. It's sort of ironic that they're talking about climate change, but then they're having to travel thousands of miles, burn a ton of jet fuel to get there. I think it just goes back down to ultimately a moral argument, both for and against fossil fuels, and then also who's on the side of making money from oil and gas production, and then who's on the side of making money from the energy transition. There's trillions of dollars at stake for the energy transition, and there's lots of money behind it. So there's the capitalism at play too, in terms of who's got the investment in what technology and that kind of a thing, or I think also really the underlying driver behind this. So interesting to see it play out though in live in social media nowadays.
Yep, absolutely, man. All right, last but not least, the rig count. So, Matt, looks like we added 3 units in the United States. All 3 of those were land units. And, man, looking at this, I was really taking in the numbers down from a year ago this week. And there's some big numbers. It's pretty interesting to see here, though we're glad to see an increase.
Yeah, so we're at 603 land rigs. We were at 763 a year ago. So we're down quite a bit, but it's good to see, that we have sort of stabilized around 600 rigs. I think we're still seeing most of the activity obviously focus on the Permian Basin, and that's where most of the additions were. Interesting that there were also 3 additional rigs in the Canna Woodford, which was, I think, kind of interesting. I think that's more Oklahoma based. I think there's maybe a shuffling around of things. They're down quite a bit though. Oklahoma was at 30 rigs, or the Canna Woodford was at 30 rigs a year ago. Now we're at 18. 3 more rigs in the Permian. They're up to 314 rigs there. They were at 350 a year ago, so down quite a bit, but also, way above any other basin when you look at it, the other areas. So I think the big focus here is you see just shuffling things around from gas to oil. So, oil prices are still at the level where companies can make money here in the US in most of these shale basins. Gas is not the case. So they're shuffling things around, I think, and that's what we're continuing to see. But yeah, I think, it'd be interesting to see what happens with the price of oil. That'll determine exactly where this goes from here, whether it sort of stabilizes if we sit above $70 a barrel, or if things continue to fall, if there's economic issues globally and that puts downward pressure on oil prices, then we'll see this rig count, I think, continue to drop into the first quarter of 2024. But really, time will tell. It's hard to say with, any sort of certainty what's going to happen, but you kind of know what you know. And what we know now is that the U.S. is, still staying very active. The number of frac crews is still around 270, something like that. So, we're still continuing to drill and complete wells, and that's really what's important.
You said it, Matt. Well, that does it for December 2023 news, and some interesting stories here.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll link, as always, to these articles in the show notes, which can be found at mineralrightspodcast.com. And as always, if you have a question you'd like to ask or an article you'd like us to cover, you can send an email to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. Until next time, thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.